Hey guys, Mr. Breen here, and in this video I'm going to be talking about the basics of bonds. So bonds are basically debt, okay? And they're debt usually issued by, that is debt, so money that is lent to governments or corporations. So governments and corporations issue these bonds, okay? And they're basically IOUs. They issue them and then they sell them to investors. And the investors give them that money. That's the loan, okay? And then the investors are owed that money back plus some interest by the governments and by the corporations. Okay, I want to make it clear to you that if you buy a bond, you don't then owe money, okay? Somebody else, a government or a corporation, owes money to you. And because these are debt, basically, bonds are often called debt instruments. It's an instrument whereby a government or a corporation can raise money. Because they are often collateralized, in other words, there's some collateral. So if they can't pay back the bond, then the government or corporation, there's some collateral that they owe to you instead, and sometimes they're called securities. Any bond has three components, just like any loan has three components. There's the par value, which is the face value of the bond, okay? And this is, you can think of this as like the principal of the loan. If we think of a bond as a loan, this is the principal. There's also a coupon rate, okay? So every so often, maybe every 3 months, in other words, quarterly, or maybe every year, there's some payment that the bond issuer makes to the bond holder, which is called the coupon payment, and this can be thought of as the interest. And there's also a maturity. So when is the bond going to mature? In other words, when is that par value going to be paid back to the bond holder by the bond issuer? And this is equivalent to a loan's term. So, for example, you might have a $1,000 bond, so you're going to have to pay $1,000 for the bond. That makes a yearly coupon payment of $50. So, in other words, this would be a 5% rate of interest every year. And the maturity is 10 years. Okay, so the bond holder pays $1,000 at the beginning. Every year, the bondholder gets paid $50 by the bond issuer, and at the end of 10 years, the $1,000 plus another $50 for that year's coupon payment gets paid back by the bond issuer to the bondholder. Okay, so with any loan, with any investment, there's a risk that the investment won't pay off. For bonds, because they're debt, because they're a loan, we're going to call this risk a risk of default. Okay, the government or corporation could fail to pay that bond back, pay the bondholder back maybe the principal, the par value, or just one of the coupon payments, but regardless, we're going to call that default. Okay, and so how do we know how risky they are? Well, we could just watch the news and say, wow, that corporation's not doing very well. Maybe there's a risk that they won't pay their bonds back, or that government isn't taking enough in taxes to cover their debts, so we're going to say maybe they're a pretty risky investment. Now, when individuals borrow money from a bank, we know that there's like a credit score, right? So some corporation watches, or some company watches their activities to see if they're good about paying things back or paying their rent or utilities, and there's a credit score, and if it's high, that means the person is very creditworthy. They're very likely to pay back a loan, and if it's low, they're much less likely to pay back a loan. Well, there are things like that for bonds too, and those are bond ratings. So there are different agencies that rate bonds. Among them, the two biggest ones are Moody's and Standard & Poor's, and this company also has a stock index. Okay, so you're going to hear this name again. And also another major company is Fitch. So if you're a corporation or a government, your bonds will be rated by these organizations according to how risky you are as a debtor. So what types of bonds are there? Well, many of you probably have savings bonds. Okay, savings bonds are issued by the federal government, by the Treasury, really, by the federal government. Okay, and they don't actually have a coupon payment. Instead, you buy them for, say, $15, and then after some number of years, they mature, and they're $20, $25, and these are very popular for, buying for your grandchildren or buying for a student or something like that, because you can get them in very small amounts. Okay, these are also, by the way, non-transferable. That means you can't sell a savings bond to someone else. In other words, there is no secondary market for savings bonds. Not so for treasury bills, bonds, and notes. These actually are all different a little bit, but I'm not going to really make you understand the difference between them for the purposes of this course, but they're all bonds that are issued by the federal treasury, so by the federal government, again. Okay, both of these are the federal government, but they're generally speaking for much larger amounts, and they have different amounts of different lengths till maturity. But these are another way that the federal government raises money. They do have coupon payments. They are transferable. If you buy a treasury bill, you can sell it to somebody else. Okay, there are also municipal bonds, which are issued by basically local governments, local city or state governments. Okay, for things like building a bridge or building a new library or a new school or something like that. There are also corporate bonds, which are issued by, obviously, corporations like Ford Motor Company or General Motors or Apple or something like that. And there are also junk bonds. And actually, junk bond is not a separate type of bond. It's just a very high-risk, high-yield bond. In other words, you can make a lot of money off of this if it works, if your bet pays off. But there's a much higher chance that it doesn't. These are very low-rated bonds. And they could be treasury bills, although our United States bills are highly rated. They could be municipal bonds, or they could be corporate bonds. Generally speaking, corporate bonds are riskier than, say, government bonds, okay? Because governments can do something that businesses can't in order to raise money. In order to raise money, businesses, to pay off their bonds, they have to produce a product and sell it. And they can't force people to buy their goods, right? Whereas for governments, they could, say, raise taxes, something that corporations can't do. So generally speaking, government bonds are considered safer, but there are always governments that are in deep, deep trouble, like right now the Greek government, whose bonds have a very high rate of interest because they're much riskier. Okay, so I want to take this moment to talk about something I just mentioned, namely bond yields. Okay, the bond yield is the percentage rate of return, ROR is rate of return, on a bond if it is held to maturity. Now, if you buy the bond and you're the primary buyer of the bond, in other words, you bought the bond, you're the first one who bought the bond from the bond holder, and you hold it all the way till maturity, okay, then the yield would be the same as the coupon rate, okay? But if you resold the bond, or if you purchased the bond on the secondary market, okay, so this is primary, but if you bought the bond on the secondary market for a different price than its face value, okay, then it's not going to be the same as the coupon rate, necessarily. If you bought it for exactly the same, price as the par value, then it will be the same as the coupon rate. But let's say it's a $1,000 bond with a $50 coupon payment. Okay, if you purchase this bond instead for $800, it still pays out a $50 coupon payment. So now, instead of the yield being 5%, now the yield is, $50 out of 80, which is 1/16, which is instead, roughly a 6.25% yield. This practice is called buying a bond at a discount. Now, why would you ever do this? Well, I made a whole different video for this, so you can go ahead and watch that. Now, I've talked a little bit about this concept previously in my video about loans, but I'll just rehash it again. For any bond market, okay, there's a primary market where bondholders purchase bonds for the first time from the bond issuer. So the bond is issued and sold directly to people in the primary markets. The first time the bond is being sold. But any subsequent time that the bond is sold, so maybe you were the primary buyer of that bond from the bondholder or the bond issuer, but you want to resell the bond for some reason, well, you would sell that bond on the secondary market. Okay, and every subsequent time that it's resold, it will be sold on the secondary market. There's also capital markets and money markets, and capital markets are the market for bonds that have a maturity greater than 1 year. Okay, greater than 1 year of maturity. And money markets are the market for bonds that are going to mature in less than 1 year. In other words, that are going to become money very shortly.